The boy walked home from school with the ease of a child who knew the sidewalks, the storefronts, and the late afternoon rhythm of Merced, California. It was December 4th, 1972, cold enough that his breath showed in small bursts as he cut across the same route he took every weekday. 7-year-old Steven Stayner didn't rush. He wasn't afraid of anything on that short walk. He was thinking about the Christmas tree his family had put up early and the argument that morning over whether a real one smelled better than the plastic one they used this year. A car slowed beside him, rolling almost silently on the pavement. The man behind the wheel wore a gentle expression and spoke in a soft voice, asking Steven if he needed a ride home. Another man sat beside him, introducing himself as a priest, saying they were collecting donations for the church. Steven hesitated. He'd been taught to be polite, not suspicious. When the man said he knew Steven's parents and that they wanted him to come along, the boy stepped closer. He didn't know he was about to disappear. Inside the car, the men guided him with quiet confidence. The priest figure, a man named Edward Murphy, spoke about helping children in need. The driver, Kenneth Parnell, kept glancing at Steven through the rearview mirror, testing how easily he could be pulled in. The drive continued past the route Steven expected them to take, past the places he recognized, and toward the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. Parnell took him to a remote cabin near Cathy's Valley. The air smelled of pine and dust. Steven was told his parents had signed papers to give him up, that they didn't want him anymore, and that Parnell would raise him instead. The lie landed with the weight of a hammer. Steven cried until he had no voice left. Parnell let him sob, then repeated the lie until the boy stopped fighting it. That was the beginning of 7 years in captivity. In the early days, Steven was kept inside, watched carefully, and told to answer to a new name, Dennis. Parnell told neighbors he was his son. He altered school records and claimed to be a single father doing the best he could. At night, behind closed doors, he abused Steven and enforced rules that made resistance feel pointless. Steven learned that if he argued, things got worse. If he stayed quiet, he was left alone for longer stretches. Months turned into years. Steven's hair grew longer. His voice changed. His childhood was lost in slow increments. Parnell took him from one town to another, Cathy's Valley, Indian Gulch, eventually Mendocino County, always staying ahead of questions. Steven attended school under the false name, made friends who never knew he was missing, and helped with small jobs around the house. People noticed he seemed thin and tired, but nothing that raised alarms. He had mastered survival by blending in. Parnell's control depended on isolation. Each time Steven got older, more independent or more confident, Parnell looked for ways to tighten his grip. He tried to hand Steven off to strangers when he wanted to leave town for short periods, then pulled him back when he felt jealous or afraid. But the biggest shift happened in 1979, when Steven reached his teenage years and Parnell realized he could no longer manipulate him in the same way. He wanted a younger child again. Parnell began trying to abduct new victims. He attempted it alone first and failed. He then pressured Steven into helping him, twisting the boy's fear and loyalty. Steven avoided hurting anyone, deliberately sabotaging attempts by warning children away or steering Parnell toward empty streets. Eventually, Parnell convinced another teenager, a friend of Steven's, to help. In February 1980, with Steven watching helplessly, Parnell abducted 5-year-old Timothy White outside his home in Ukiah. Timothy was terrified from the moment he was taken. Steven saw his own past repeated with brutal clarity. He recognized the same fear, the same confusion, the same trapped look he had carried when he was 7. Parnell instantly tried to repeat the cycle, cutting Timothy's hair, planning to rename him, beginning the same lies he had used on Steven. That was the line Steven refused to cross. He had endured 7 years of captivity because he felt powerless, but he would not watch another child lose a childhood the way he lost his. Over the next few weeks, Steven comforted Timothy as quietly as he could. He told him stories, held his hand when Parnell wasn't watching, and whispered that he would get him home. When Timothy cried at night, Steven stayed awake to make sure he wasn't alone. Steven knew escaping alone might work. Escaping with a 5-year-old was dangerous and unpredictable, but he also knew the risk of staying was worse. He waited for the right moment when Parnell was gone for the night. The cabin was cold. Timothy trembled, not understanding what was happening. Steven told him to grab his shoes, and the two stepped out into the darkness, walking fast, then running. They reached the highway and began searching for a way into Ukiah. Steven navigated the area by memory, guiding Timothy along streets he had learned during years of forced normalcy. They walked until Steven found a police station. Timothy clung to him, confused by the unfamiliar building. Steven pushed him gently inside. When the officers asked who the child was, Timothy gave his name through sobs. When they asked Steven, he hesitated, then said the words he had carried for years. "I know my first name is Steven." The officers realized he was not just a runaway teenager. He was the missing boy whose face had once been printed on flyers all over the state. Timothy was returned to his parents that same night. Steven was reunited with a family that had never stopped searching for him. But coming home was not simple. The house was smaller than he remembered. His siblings were older, almost strangers. His parents didn't know how to talk to a child who had lived an entire lifetime somewhere else. He struggled with school, with rules, with the feeling that the world had moved on without him. For a long time, Steven slept on the floor beside his bed because beds felt foreign. He had lived with fear for so long that ordinary safety felt unreal. He tried to explain to his parents that he had adapted to survive, that captivity had rewritten him in ways he couldn't undo. When he said, "I didn't know what to do, so I did the best I could," it was the closest he came to describing 7 years of forced silence. Parnell was arrested and convicted, but his sentence frustrated everyone who knew what he had done. He served only a handful of years for kidnapping. The abuse, the violence, the stolen childhood, all were pushed aside by legal limitations at the time. Timothy White grew up grateful to Steven, insisting for the rest of his life that Steven had saved him. Steven chose quiet adulthood. He married, had children, and worked to rebuild himself from the inside out. He talked little about the details of captivity, focusing instead on Timothy's rescue. When he died in a motorcycle accident in 1989 at the age of 24, people across California mourned a man who had been a victim, a survivor, and finally, a protector. Timothy White became a deputy sheriff and carried Steven's courage with him. When Timothy died young as well, both men were honored with a statue showing Steven leading 5-year-old Timothy by the hand, the moment that defined them both. Steven Stayner survived 7 years in captivity because he learned how to stay alive under a man who tried to erase his identity. He escaped because he refused to let another child's life be destroyed the way his had been. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.